The rain in Geneva that evening was a cold, methodical adversary. It was not the passionate, cathartic fury of a thunderstorm, but a fine, persistent drizzle that fell with the tirelessness of a siege engine, a million tiny silver needles stitching the city to the bruised gray sky. It was a rain designed to infiltrate every defense, to find the smallest gap in a collar or cuff and seep into the very marrow of the bones, leaving a chill that no amount of coffee or cognac could entirely banish. It slicked the ancient, worn cobblestones of the Vieille Ville, turning the narrow, canyon-like alleys into dark, reflecting mirrors of distant neon and the warm, buttery glow of replica gas lamps. For the three men occupying the funereal silence of a gray Peugeot Traveler, parked halfway down the Rue des Granges with its engine a whisper-quiet hum, the rain was a confederate. It washed away the future memory of footprints. It muffled the incidental metallic sounds of preparation, and it hurried the city's pedestrians along, heads bowed, their worlds shrinking to the next dry awning. It created a city of isolated, moving bubbles of light and purpose, and their target was about to drift, unknowingly, into their net. Her name was Anya Orloff. 21 years of age, a doctoral candidate in particle physics at the university, a mind that danced with the esoteric ballet of quarks and gluons, a world of elegant equations that promised to explain the very fabric of existence. She was also the only child, the cherished, protected, and utterly isolated weakness of General Major Dmitry Volkov Orlov, the formidable and feared director of the GRU's clandestine operations throughout Western Europe. To the world, she was just another luminous, privileged international student, her future a bright, uncomplicated line stretching towards academic renown. To Dame Eleanor Vance, who was at that moment observing a shimmering, high-resolution satellite feed on a plasma screen 500 miles away in the climate-controlled quiet of London's Vauxhall Cross, Anya Orloff was the fulcrum upon which the entire balance of power in Europe was about to be brutally and irrevocably levered. Silas, status, a voice whispered, not in the driver's ear, but seemingly inside his skull. The voice was calm, clipped, and belonged to David Cartwright, the mission controller, the architect of this night's brutal theater. It was transmitted through a subdermal transducer. A tiny implant vibrated against the mastoid bone behind Silas's ear, a piece of Q-branch technology that rendered external earpieces obsolete and made the communication utterly, intimately private. A faint, almost imperceptible tingle was the only physical sensation. Silas, the man behind the wheel, did not so much as twitch a muscle. His eyes, the washed-out blue of faded denim, performed a slow, methodical sweep of the rain-streaked street, clocking every shadow, every flicker of movement in the warped reflection of a shop window. He was a creature of immense patience, a predator comfortable in stillness, his breathing slow and even. He could smell the damp wool of his overcoat, the faint, lingering scent of CLP oil from the SIG sour P226 he'd stripped and cleaned 3 hours earlier, and the stale, acrid bitterness of the half-smoked Gauloises he'd stubbed out in the ashtray when the target's tracker pinged the 500-meter perimeter. "Target is on approach," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that barely disturbed the air in the van. 200 meters and closing. South side pavement. Umbrella is black, totes brand. Coat is red, Burberry trench. No deviation from predicted routine. No obvious surveillance, hostile or friendly. The street is cold. In the cavernous, rubber-matted rear of the van, 2 other men, known operationally only as Ben and Marcus, completed their final, silent preparations. They moved with the unhurried economy of professionals, for whom this was just another night at the office, albeit an office that occasionally involved state-sanctioned kidnapping. They were not spies in the traditional sense, not the sort who charmed secrets out of embassy attachés over martinis. They were operators from the regiment, 22 SAS, seconded to MI6 for their specific, brutal efficiency. Their civilian overcoats, nondescript and charcoal gray, concealed the stark black architecture of tactical webbing and Crye-precision body armor beneath. On the floor between them lay a black canvas bag. Inside was not a ransom kit, but a curated collection of theatrical props. A modified M84 flashbang grenade, its explosive charge replaced to produce a blinding 200,000 candela strobe and a disorienting 180 decibel sonic pulse with almost no concussive force. A hypodermic injector pen, its sleek chrome casing holding a 2 cubic centimeter payload of a fast-acting benzodiazepine derivative, codenamed Lullaby. A handful of military-grade flex cuffs, a black, light-proof hood. "Asset 1 in position," came the voice of a woman, an MI6 watcher codenamed Sparrow, her own transducer relaying her words from a fourth-floor apartment overlooking the street. She's a local artist, canvas and easel set up by the window. Plausible witness. She has her DSLR with a 400mm telephoto lens ready. Framing is perfect. "Asset 2 confirmed," said another voice, this one belonging to a man who was, at that moment, lurching out of a nearby bar, reeking of deliberately spilled schnapps and cheap cigars. "Ready to make a scene. I'll draw eyes away from the vehicle and onto the tram line." This was the intricate, multi-layered ballet of modern espionage. Not a lone man in a trench coat, but a coordinated, multi-asset operation, planned with the obsessive, redundant detail of a moon landing. Every variable was accounted for, every contingency mapped in a decision tree that branched into a dizzying infinity. The objective was simple in its statement and monstrously complex in its execution. To abduct Anya Orlov, to terrify her, to psychologically break her formidable father, and to do it all without leaving a single, genuine trace of their existence. They were ghosts, preparing to stage a very loud, very violent haunting. Silas watched her approach in the driver's side mirror, the image distorted by rivulets of rain. The red coat was a vibrant slash of carmine against the monochromatic gloom, a beacon in the gray. She walked with the easy, confident stride of a young woman, untroubled by the world, her head likely filled with complex equations about quantum chromodynamics and the simple promise of a quiet evening with her books. She was entirely, blissfully unaware that she was the centerpiece of a multi-million-pound intelligence operation, the human key to unlocking the most heavily guarded secrets of the Kremlin. 50 meters, Silas murmured, his hand resting lightly on the gear shift. The van's engine was a low, electric hum, a barely perceptible vibration in the chassis. It was a commercial delivery vehicle, a Peugeot Traveler, but it had been modified by Q-Branch to the point of absurdity. The body panels were lined with a radar-absorbent polymer mesh that could scatter and absorb thermal imaging. The engine was a hybrid, capable of running completely silent on its electric motor up to 40 miles per hour. The license plates were thin, flexible e-ink displays, capable of changing at the flick of a switch to a cloned set of diplomatic plates registered to the Venezuelan embassy, an organization known for its less-than-legal side hustles and therefore a perfect source of background noise and official confusion. "Stand by," Cartwright's voice commanded from London, a thread of steel in the calm. "Execute on my mark. Remember the parameters. She is not to be harmed. The fear is the weapon, not the force. Make it look like Chechens. Make it brutal, messy, and unprofessional. We are the professionals whose sole task tonight is to pretend to be amateurs. Anya Orloff reached the corner, folding her wet umbrella with a practiced flick of her wrist as she prepared to duck under the awning of a closed patisserie. The air smelled of rain and old stone and the faint, sweet ghost of yesterday's croissants. It was the designated blind spot, momentarily obscured from Sparrow's fourth-floor window by a thick stone buttress of the adjacent building. It was a 3-second window, calculated and confirmed by a dozen topographical and architectural simulations. "Mark," said Cartwright. The world, for Anya Orloff, exploded. Silas slammed the van into drive, the electric motor whining like a tortured animal as it surged across the wet cobblestones, mounting the curb with a jarring thump that rattled Silas's teeth. The side door slid open with a pneumatic hiss before they had even come to a complete stop. Ben and Marcus spilled out, moving with a fluid, predatory economy that belied their bulk. Asset 2, the drunk, chose that exact moment to stumble into the middle of the road, shouting a stream of garbled French at a passing tram, its bell clanging in alarm. It was a perfect piece of misdirection, a cheap magic trick drawing the audience's eyes while the real, terrible work was done elsewhere. Anya looked up, her expression a canvas of surprise, not yet fear. That came a half-second later as Marcus, a mountain in a dark coat, grabbed her. One gloved hand clamped over her mouth, stifling the scream before it was even born, the other snaking around her waist, lifting her clean off her feet. She was strong, a swimmer, and she fought, kicking and struggling, a muffled, desperate scream lost against the thick leather of his glove. Ben was the artist of the scene, the set dresser. He didn't touch her. He ripped her leather satchel from her shoulder, scattering textbooks, a MacBook, and a sheaf of papers across the wet ground. He took out the M84 strobe grenade, pulled the pin with a practiced thumb, and tossed it not at her, but 5 feet away, towards the stone wall of the patisserie. The flash was a silent, artificial sun, a supernova that bleached the alley of all color and burned a searing white afterimage onto every retina within 30 meters. The sonic pulse hit a split second later. Not just a sound, but a physical blow. A pressure wave that vibrated deep in the chest and felt like the world's biggest bass drum being struck right next to your heart. It was designed to overload the senses, to shatter cognitive function and induce a state of temporary paralysis. From Sparrow's window, it would look like a real explosion, the flash momentarily whiting out her camera's sensor. The drunk would collapse, clutching his ears. A few lights would flicker on in the apartments above, windows opening onto a scene of manufactured chaos. In the disorienting, ringing aftermath, Anya went limp, her struggles ceasing as her brain tried to reboot from the sensory overload. Marcus used the moment of neurological chaos to sweep her into the van. Silas was already pulling away from the curb as the side door slid shut. Ben, his work on the street complete, did not get back in. He melted into a side alley, his part in the play concluded. He would walk 2 blocks north, descend into a public car park, get into a waiting Fiat Punto, and be halfway to Lyon before the first Swiss police car arrived. His operational identity was already being shed like a snake's skin. Inside the van, it was a maelstrom of controlled violence. The shock was wearing off, replaced by pure animal terror, and Anya started to scream, a raw, high-pitched sound of disbelief and horror. Marcus pinned her to the floor, his weight a crushing, impersonal force. Ben, now inside and kneeling over her, uncapped the injector pen with a metallic click and pressed the cold metal tip against the side of her neck. She flinched, a small, choked cry escaping her lips. And then her body went slack, her eyes rolling back as the drug flooded her system, a chemical blanket smothering the fire of her consciousness. They pulled the black hood over her head, and secured her hands in front of her with the zip ties, pulling them tight enough to be uncomfortable, to leave red marks, but not to break the skin. Every detail was calculated. "Subject is secure," Silas reported, his voice utterly flat, betraying none of the adrenaline singing like high-tension wires in his veins. He navigated the labyrinth of Geneva's old town, his driving smooth and unhurried, that of a delivery man finishing his shift, not a kidnapper fleeing a crime scene. Exiting the primary zone. "Change plates," Cartwright ordered from London. The digital display on the license plate flickered, the Swiss registration vanishing, replaced by the red and white of a Venezuelan diplomatic credential. "Activate jammer. Full spectrum." Silas pressed a recessed button on the console. A low-frequency hum filled the vehicle, undetectable to the human ear, but a roaring hurricane in the electromagnetic spectrum. It broadcast a powerful blanket of white noise from 300 megahertz to 3 gigahertz, scrambling any GPS trackers, cellular signals, or clandestine listening devices within a 50-meter radius. They were a ghost in the machine, a moving dead zone in the heart of one of the most surveilled cities in the world. From her apartment, Sparrow was already on the phone with the Geneva police, her voice pitched with carefully rehearsed hysteria. "A bomb! Oh my God, I think it was a bomb. They took a girl. She was wearing a red coat. They were shouting. I think it was Russian or something like it." She would give a perfect description of the van, but with 2 digits of the license plate transposed. She would describe the men as swarthy, bearded, the classic Western stereotype of Chechen militants. Every word she spoke was a carefully laid breadcrumb designed to lead the entire Swiss security apparatus down a meticulously constructed false trail. The entire event, from the moment the van moved to the moment it disappeared into the warren of streets, had taken less than 15 seconds. To Anya Orlov, it was an eternity of blinding light, deafening sound, and abject terror. To MI6, it was simply Phase 1. Back in London, inside the sterile, climate-controlled citadel of Vauxhall Cross, Dame Eleanor Vance watched the aftermath unfold on a dozen screens. Swiss police feeds, traffic cameras, social media scrapes. She saw the first police cars arriving, their cobalt blue lights painting the wet streets in frantic, silent strokes. She saw the confused witnesses gathering, their stories already conflicting, polluted by the planted narratives of Assets 1 and 2. It was a masterpiece of organized chaos, a Jackson Pollock painting of misinformation. "Phase 1 complete," she said, her voice betraying a sliver of professional satisfaction. She turned to David Cartwright, who stood beside her, his face illuminated by the cool blue glow of the monitors. He was a man in his late 40s, with the weary, intelligent eyes of a scholar and the sharp, bespoke suit of a city banker. He looked more like a history professor than the architect of an international kidnapping. "The bait is laid, David," she said, her gaze steady. "Now we wait for the bear to leave his cave." Cartwright nodded, his focus fixed on a particular screen. It showed a live feed from a micro camera, no larger than a pinhead, hidden in a light fixture opposite General Orlov's secure apartment in Bern. He'll get the call from the university liaison within the hour. The Swiss police will contact the Russian embassy in 2. He'll be in Geneva by midnight. The first 24 hours are crucial. His training will kick in. He'll suspect his own people, rival factions within the GRU, the FSB. He'll try to handle it himself, quietly, to avoid losing face. And he will fail, Vance finished for him, a cold certainty in her tone. Because every path he takes, every contact he makes, will lead him deeper into a maze of our own design. The mission, codenamed Nightingale, had been 6 months in the planning. It was born from a chilling piece of intelligence, a whisper from a low-level, terrified source in Minsk about a new Russian military doctrine. Scythe. It was a blueprint for a lightning-fast, hybrid warfare assault on the Baltic states, utilizing cyber attacks, special forces, and fifth columnists to fracture NATO before the alliance could even convene a meeting to trigger Article 5. It was audacious, terrifying, and according to their analysts, theoretically unstoppable. To counter it, they needed the entire playbook, and the man who held the keys to it, the man who had helped write its deadliest chapters, was General Dmitry Orlov. Orlov was a monolith, a product of the old Soviet system, fiercely patriotic, brutally intelligent, and utterly incorruptible. He couldn't be bribed with money or blackmailed with vice. He had no weaknesses. Except one. The daughter he adored. The one he had deliberately sent to neutral Switzerland to keep her safe from the toxic, brutal world he inhabited. He had built a fortress around his heart, and Anya was the only precious thing he had allowed to remain inside. Cartwright had identified this vulnerability with the cold precision of a surgeon locating an inoperable tumor. It was a cruel, barbaric strategy. But in their world, cruelty was just another tool, measured only by its effectiveness. The Peugeot traveler, now bearing French plates, crossed the border into France without incident. The diplomatic credentials were not even checked by the sleepy border guards. They drove high into the Alps, the city lights of Geneva shrinking behind them, giving way to the profound, absolute darkness of the mountains. Their destination was a secluded chateau near Megève, leased for the past year by a shell corporation owned by MI6. It was isolated, defensible, and most importantly, its basement had been acoustically sealed by a team from Q Branch. It was a place where someone could scream for a week, and the only thing that would hear them was the ancient stone. When Anya woke, it was to an absence of everything. The darkness was not the gentle dark of a bedroom, but a thick, suffocating blackness that seemed to have weight and texture, pressing in on her from all sides. She was on a thin, lumpy mattress on a cold concrete floor. Her head throbbed with a dull chemical ache, and her mouth was as dry as sand. The hood was gone, but it made no difference. There was no light. She tried to move, but her wrists and ankles were bound by the same sharp-edged zip ties. Panic, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, lanced through the fog in her brain. She took a breath to scream, but the air was stale and heavy with the scent of damp earth and mold, and the sound died in her throat. A pathetic, choked gasp. A heavy metal door scraped open, the sound of rusted iron on concrete echoing in the small space. A rectangle of harsh, yellow light spilled into the room, blinding her. A figure stood silhouetted against it. He was large, built like Marcus, and wore a balaclava that obscured all his features. He spoke, his voice a low growl, distorted by a digital voice modulator. The language was a harsh, guttural Chechen. Anya didn't understand a single word, but she understood the raw menace in his tone. He placed a plastic bottle of water and a piece of stale bread on the floor, just out of her reach, a deliberate act of petty cruelty. Then he left, the door slamming shut, plunging her back into the abyss of silence and darkness. This was the beginning of her psychological conditioning, a precise and brutal symphony orchestrated by Dr. Iris Thorne, MI6's premier mind-bender, who was at that moment monitoring her heart rate and galvanic skin response from a control room down the hall. Every element of her captivity was calculated. The sensory deprivation to induce disorientation and dependency. The inconsistent feeding schedule to shatter her internal sense of time. The unintelligible threats from the guards, Silas and Marcus, playing their parts with grim professionalism to establish a credible, terrifying enemy. They were not breaking her body. They were dismantling her reality, piece by piece, so they could rebuild it in the shape they required. Meanwhile, in Geneva, General Orloff was a caged animal. The initial report from the Swiss police was a hopeless mess of contradictions. A bomb, a kidnapping, bearded men, shouts in a foreign language that might have been Russian or Arabic or Farsi. The FSB's station chief in Geneva, a smug, ambitious man named Borodin, whom Orloff despised, offered hollow condolences and promises of full assistance. But Orloff could see the glint of unconcealed satisfaction in his rival's eyes. The FSB loved nothing more than a GRU failure, and this was a spectacular one, happening on the general's own doorstep. Orloff knew he was alone. For 2 days, he used his own private network, calling in decades-old favors, activating dormant assets across Europe. He was a master of the shadows, but now he was stumbling in a darkness someone else had created. The trails MI6 had laid were perfect. A burned-out Peugeot van was found in a slum on the outskirts of Lyon, a known hub for Chechen gangs. The van's VIN was linked to a vehicle stolen in Marseille 2 months prior. Inside the scorched interior, the French forensics team found a single strand of dark hair wedged in the passenger door seal. A hair that, when its DNA was tested, would be a partial match for a known Chechen extremist currently in a French prison. The hair had been lifted from the man's prison-issue comb by a bribed guard weeks earlier. It was a flawless piece of misdirection. Orloff grew more desperate, more haggard, with each passing hour. The Swiss were incompetent. His own people were either unwilling or unable to help, paralyzed by internal rivalries. He sat in his daughter's silent apartment in Bern, the faint scent of her perfume, something with jasmine and citrus, hanging in the air like a ghost. He picked up a dog-eared copy of a physics textbook from her nightstand, the pages filled with her neat, precise annotations. And for the first time in his decorated career, the general felt the cold, hard fist of helplessness closing around his throat. On the 3rd day, the approach was made. It wasn't a clandestine meeting in a foggy park or a secret phone call. It was far more elegant, more British. Orloff had a single private passion for antique maps, a small indulgence in a life of brutal austerity. His favorite dealer was a quiet, elderly man named Monsieur Dubois, whose shop was tucked away in Geneva's old town. Orloff went there, seeking a moment of familiar normalcy in the chaos. As Dubois showed him a rare 17th-century map of Muscovy, the old man paused, his papery hand stilling on the vellum. A colleague of mine in London, a fellow cartographer, asked me to give you this, the old man said, his face as impassive as stone. He slid a small, sealed envelope of heavy cream-colored paper across the polished wood of the counter. He said it concerns a matter of great urgency and mutual interest. Orloff's training, honed over 30 years of counterintelligence, screamed at him. It was a trap. Dubois was an asset for someone, but his paternal desperation overrode his professional caution. He took the envelope. Inside was a single, small card. On it was a string of alphanumeric characters and a simple web address for a secure, one-time-use messaging platform hosted on the dark web. There were no instructions, no threats, just the key to a door. That night, in the sterile security of the Russian consulate, Orloff accessed the site on a wiped, untraceable laptop. He entered the 24-character code. A single line of text appeared on the screen, green against a black background. We know who has Anya. We know where they are. The Chechen Brotherhood does not negotiate. But we can help you get her back. A second line appeared. Jardin Anglais, tomorrow, 1400 hours, by the l'Horloge Fleurie. Come alone. The message vanished. The page erased itself, leaving a blank browser window. Orlov stared at the screen, his heart pounding a frantic, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The English phraseology, the cool directness, the mention of the Chechens. It wasn't the FSB. It wasn't one of his internal rivals. This was an outside player. He suspected the Americans, the ever-present CIA. But the reference to the Jardin Anglais felt different, more subtle, more British. The next day, under a sky the color of lead, General Orlov walked alone through the English garden. He was a ghost in a tailored suit, his face pale, his movements stiff with tension. He was being watched. He knew it. His own security detail was 200 meters back, pretending to be tourists. The FSB would have a team, the Swiss. The park was alive with unseen eyes. A man was sitting on a bench near the famous flower clock, reading a copy of the Financial Times. He was impeccably dressed in a dark gray suit, his black Oxford shoes polished to a mirror shine. He didn't look up as Orlov approached. It was David Cartwright. "General," Cartwright said, his voice calm, conversational. He folded his newspaper with a crisp rustle. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." Orlov remained standing, his body rigid, a statue of suspicion. "Who are you?" "A friend," Cartwright replied smoothly. "Someone who believes that the abduction of a young woman for political ends is a line that shouldn't be crossed, regardless of which side of the board we play on." He gestured to the empty space on the bench. "Please, we don't have much time." Reluctantly, Orlov sat, leaving a careful foot of distance between them. Cartwright didn't waste time on pleasantries. He produced a tablet from his briefcase. "This is satellite imagery from 1 hour after the abduction," he said, tapping the screen. It showed a blurry infrared image of a convoy of 2 cars heading south from Lyon into the mountains. Our signals intelligence picked up a burst of encrypted chatter from this convoy. It was broadcast on the 421.750 MHz frequency. It was a dialect of Chechen used exclusively by the Boers Akhmatov Brigade. They're fanatics, former jihadis from Syria. They operate for hire. Everything Cartwright showed him was a flawless fabrication. The satellite image was from a U.S. military training exercise in Nevada, repurposed and redated by GCHQ. The signal's intercept was generated by their AI language models, a perfect linguistic and technical replica. It was a symphony of lies, composed to play on Orlov's deepest fears. "They've taken her to a compound in the Vercors Massif," Cartwright continued, showing Orlov a grainy, long-lens photograph of a remote farmhouse. It was a decoy location, an abandoned property MI6 had been monitoring for months. "They are demanding the release of 3 of their comrades from a Russian high-security prison. They sent the demand to a cutout in Istanbul. Your government will not negotiate. You know this. They will let her die before they bow to terrorists." The words hit Orlov like a physical blow, because he knew, with sickening certainty, that they were true. The Kremlin's policy on terrorism was absolute and unyielding. His daughter's life was strategically irrelevant. "Why are you telling me this?" Orlov asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "What do you want from me?" "We want to help," Cartwright said, his gaze steady and infuriatingly sincere. "My organization has assets in France. We can mount a rescue. We can get her out. But an operation of this nature carries significant risk and cost. We need a gesture of goodwill from you, a sign that our interests are aligned. You want me to betray my country? It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. I want you to save your daughter. Cartwright corrected him gently. We're not asking for state secrets, General. Not yet. We need information. A list of GRU logistical caches in Germany, low-level supply depots, fuel dumps, medical supplies. Nothing that would compromise national security. Just enough to prove that you are serious. Think of it as a deposit. We get your daughter back, and then we can discuss a more permanent arrangement. You help us, we help you. Orlov stood up, his face a mask of fury and profound conflict. If this is a trick, if anything happens to her because of you, if you do nothing, she is dead already, Cartwright said, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly. The choice is yours, General. The list, delivered to our mutual friend, the mapmaker, by noon tomorrow. We'll be in touch. Cartwright stood, folded his newspaper neatly under his arm, and walked away, melting into the sparse crowd of tourists without a backward glance. He knew he had set the hook. For Orlov, it was a night of unmitigated hell. Treason was a concept so alien to him, it was like contemplating a fourth dimension. He was a guardian of the Rodina, the motherland. His entire identity was built on that foundation. But then he saw Anya's face in his mind. Her laugh, the way she would wrinkle her nose when he said something old-fashioned and paternal. The general and the father were at war inside his soul. And by the gray, merciless light of dawn, the father had won. The next day, he returned to the map shop. He purchased a large, expensive map of the Ottoman Empire, and as he paid in cash, he palmed a tiny, encrypted flash drive to Monsieur Dubois. It contained the locations, access codes, and patrol schedules for 3 GRU supply caches in the Black Forest. It was a minor betrayal in the grand scheme of things, but it was a betrayal nonetheless. The first crack in the dam. The rescue was scheduled for the following night. It was pure theater, but it was played for a very specific audience, the FSB and GRU eavesdroppers, who were undoubtedly monitoring everything around Orlov. MI6 deployed a 12-man team from their Special Operations Branch. They approached the decoy farmhouse in the Vercors MI6 with all the sound and fury of a genuine assault. They used real explosives to breach the gate. They exchanged gunfire with each other, using blanks and carefully placed squibs, creating a cacophony of a firefight. Their comms were a frantic stream of battlefield chatter, broadcast on a frequency they knew the Russian SIGINT station in Lourdes monitored. Contact front. Man down. Man down. They're pulling back to the east. Hostage is in a black Audi, moving east. We've lost them, damn it. In Bern, Orlov listened to the intercept via a secure channel from a loyalist within his own agency. He heard the gunfire, the shouting, the feigned desperation. He heard the manufactured failure. Cartwright called him an hour later on a burner phone. They were waiting for us, General. Someone must have tipped them off. They got away. They still have Anya. Cartwright's voice was laced with expertly feigned frustration. They're panicking. They'll be moving her again, and if they do, we'll lose her for good. We have one more chance. But it has to be now. I need to call in every favor I have to get a new location. But it will cost me everything. And I need more from you. Something significant. Something to justify this level of risk. Orlov was at his breaking point. The failed rescue, the imminent danger to Anya. It was all too much. What? He croaked into the phone, his voice raw. "What do you want?" There was a carefully timed pause. Then Cartwright delivered the killing blow. "We need the Scythe doctrine. The full technical specifications, the operational playbook, the activation protocols, everything." The blood drained from Orlov's face. This wasn't a list of caches. This was the holy of holies, the crown jewels of Russia's military strategy. To give it up was not just treason. It was surrendering the sword of his nation into the hands of his enemy. "I can't," he whispered. "Then say goodbye to your daughter," Cartwright said, his voice as cold and hard as ice. "They'll kill her and dump her body where it will never be found. You have 1 hour to decide." He hung up. The hour was the longest of Dmitry Orlov's life. He saw his entire existence, his career, his patriotism, his oath to the motherland, arrayed on one side of a scale. On the other side was Anya's face. In the end, there was no choice at all. He made the call. "I will do it." The transfer was arranged with meticulous care. Orlov hid the data, encrypted on a microdot so small it was nearly invisible, inside the decorative facing of his left cufflink. He went to a public restroom in the Boron train station. As he washed his hands at the sink, a man in a janitor's uniform bumped into him, apologizing profusely in accented German. In that brief, clumsy contact, the cufflinks were swapped. The janitor was Silas, unrecognizable in his disguise and a prosthetic scar. He was out of the station and on a train to Zurich before Orlov had even finished drying his hands. Now, MI6 had to deliver. The final act of the play was about to begin. Inside the Alpine chateau, Anya was brought from the dark room into a dimly lit one. She was weak, disoriented, her sense of reality frayed and thin. A new man, his face also covered by a balaclava, spoke to her in broken, heavily accented English. It was Dr. Thorne, the psychologist. "Your father." He did not pay. He grunted, his voice a cruel parody. "You are no use to us now." He injected her again, but this time it was not a sedative. It was a carefully titrated cocktail of ketamine and midazolam, psychoactive drugs designed to induce a state of heightened confusion and anterograde amnesia for the next several hours. They dressed her in a fresh set of clothes, drove her 2 hours away, and left her on a quiet roadside near the town of Annecy, France. They placed an anonymous call to the French gendarmerie, reporting an abandoned, distressed woman. Then the cleanup crew moved in. The sterile team, flown in from London, descended on the chateau. They were forensic ghosts. They replaced carpets, repainted walls, and scrubbed every surface with industrial solvents that would destroy DNA. They used electrostatic lifters to remove any stray fibers or hairs. They ran powerful degaussing magnets over every electronic device to wipe any residual digital signatures. By the time they were done, the chateau was more than clean. It was as if the past 3 days had never happened at all. Every trace of Anya Orlov's ordeal and of MI6's presence was erased from existence. The reunion happened in a sterile white room in a French hospital. When Orlov saw Anya, his iron composure finally broke. She was sitting on the edge of a bed, a coarse blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes vacant and filled with a terror he could barely comprehend. He rushed to her, wrapping her in his arms, holding her as if she were a fragile piece of glass that might shatter. He was a general major of the GRU, a man who had stared down death and betrayal without flinching, and he was weeping like a child. Anya flinched at his touch, her body still wired for fear. She couldn't remember much. Flashes of darkness, a guttural voice, the stinging feeling of a needle. Her memory of the event was a shattered mirror, and MI6 had carefully swept up all the important pieces. The official story, agreed upon by the French and Swiss authorities at the gentle urging of the British Embassy, was that she had been found by police, a victim of a kidnapping by unknown assailants who had apparently lost their nerve. The case would remain open, unsolved, a permanent mystery. Holding his trembling daughter, Orlov felt a wave of gratitude so profound it almost buckled his knees. These strangers, these Western spies, had saved her when his own country would have let her die. His loyalty, forged in the fires of the Cold War and tempered by decades of ruthless service, shattered. A new loyalty, born of desperation and relief, took its place. He now belonged to the people who had given him back his world. That night, Cartwright received the first official intelligence package from their new asset, codenamed Nightingale. It was an urgent update, a change in the activation schedule for the Scythe Doctrine. The timeline had been moved up. The invasion was closer than anyone had thought. The operation was a success. Nightingale was singing. 6 months later, London was bathed in the pale, watery light of a spring afternoon. In Dame Eleanor Vance's top-floor office overlooking the Thames, the mood was one of quiet, restrained triumph. Nightingale had become the most valuable asset MI6 had ever run. He was pouring out the GRU's deepest secrets: agent networks, covert operations, political intentions. The Scythe Doctrine had been effectively neutralized, its key components preemptively countered by a series of quiet NATO troop movements and cyber warfare initiatives that the Russians had mistaken for routine exercises. "He's given us their entire order of battle in the Baltics," Cartwright said, gesturing to a map on the screen. "It's unprecedented. We've neutered them for a decade." "A risky venture, David," Vance said, swirling the amber liquid in her glass of single malt. "But a successful one. The Home Secretary is delighted. Your promotion is all but guaranteed." An aide entered and handed Cartwright a slim file folder. "The final post-op psych report on the subject, sir. From Dr. Thorne." Cartwright opened it. It was mostly standard procedure. A summary of Anya Orlov's recovery. She had returned to her studies in Geneva. Her memory of the event remained fragmented, a blessing for all involved. She was, Thorne noted, remarkably resilient. But as Cartwright's eyes scanned the final paragraph, a chill that had nothing to do with the office's air conditioning crept up his spine. Thorne had written, "Subject exhibits remarkable fortitude. However, one persistent sensory detail has surfaced during therapy sessions. She has a recurring olfactory memory associated with one of her captors, the one who spoke to her in English during the final phase before her release. She cannot recall his face or voice clearly, but she remembers a distinct scent. She described it as clean and sharp, like an old library or a gentleman's study. Specifically, she identified notes of lavender and bergamot." Cartwright stopped reading. The file in his hands felt suddenly heavy. He slowly raised a hand to his collar, to the knot of his silk tie. The scent of his own cologne, a bespoke blend from a small shop on Jermyn Street that he had worn for 20 years, suddenly felt suffocatingly, damningly strong. Lavender and bergamot. And he remembered the weeks of meticulous preparation leading up to the operation. He had personally conducted the final surveillance on Anya, playing the part of a visiting British history professor at her university, a role he relished. He'd needed to get close, to confirm her routines, her lack of personal security. He had spoken to her twice, briefly, in a campus coffee shop, asking for directions to the library. A minor, calculated risk, an insignificant detail in a sea of meticulous planning. He looked up at Dame Eleanor, his face a pale mask. She saw the look in his eyes, the sudden, stark terror, and her faint, satisfied smile vanished. "David, what is it?" He didn't need to answer. She was already piecing it together. In their world, there was no such thing as an insignificant detail. The operation was a success, a textbook victory that had reshaped the geopolitical landscape of Europe. But they hadn't just turned a general. They had created a time bomb, a single fragile thread of human memory that could